For many people, it can be hard to pinpoint where their issues come from. Whether people struggle with too much anxiety, some type of eating disorder, anger issues, or maybe depression has taken over their life. People often don't know what the cause is for that problem, and they certainly haven't figured out how to change it, even though they may have been trying for a very long time now. Even when people can name the source of their problems, such things as being neglected or unloved by their parents, or maybe having experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse when they were younger, it often seems very difficult to shake off the negative effects from their past. They live their lives always plagued by feelings from the past that continue to affect how they feel about themselves. It can affect their relationships in a very bad way, and it can even keep them from being able to take any kind of risk in life. The effects of people's past can be paralyzing for some, and at the very least, it can keep them from enjoying their life, and it takes away their ability to experience the best version of themselves. Worst of all, it probably feels like to many that there simply isn't any way out of their struggle, and that inevitably, the rest of their life has to be like this because they've tried for so long to change how they feel, but they keep ending up with the same results. And then there's only themselves to blame, which feels terrible on top of everything else. In this video, I want to explain why these issues exist and why they can be so difficult to deal with. The explanation lies in understanding the science of the brain and how the brain deals with difficult situations that we face throughout our lives. Some people wonder how they can struggle so much even though they haven't experienced anything that might be considered major trauma in their lives. Honestly, that's because it doesn't take major traumatic events to cause serious problems in a person's life down the road. Let's refer to these past negative events as trauma. Some trauma is what we call big T trauma. Things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, serious accidents, or serious neglect. Then there's what we call little T trauma. Things like not measuring up to what our parents and teachers want from us, or getting criticized for something people around us see as weak in their eyes. Or maybe we don't like our body type, and we always find ways to criticize how much we eat, or how we look that day. Little T trauma might just have been existing as the middle child in a family and getting overlooked all the time. Both big T trauma and little t trauma can have serious implications for how a person behaves and how they feel about themselves later in life, and it becomes near impossible to just let it go or ignore it. The good news is that through certain methods and counseling, a person can let that bad experience go and move past those negative feelings and behaviors if they find the courage to really face their problems. Many people never find that courage and try to push their problems under the rug, so to speak. Maybe they just don't know that real help that works is available. So to understand those struggles, it can help to understand what's going on in our brain when we first experience something mildly or seriously traumatic. To understand that process, it can be helpful to view the brain as two different regions. First, the smart part of the brain, what's called the prefrontal cortex. And then there's the instinctual part of the brain called the limbic system and the brainstem. You can think of these two parts as having different reactions to what happens in your life. Think about times you had mixed emotions about something. That's a good illustration of how there is more going on in our heads than we realize. Also, remember that the job of the lower brain is mostly to identify what you should be afraid of, what might cause you harm. And it works really, really hard at doing that job. Now consider this fact. The instinctual part of the brain has a direct connection to the back of a person's retina, which means our instinctual part of our brain can see and react to something before the smart part of our brain has the ability to process it. In other words, when we see something like a situation, a person, or an event, our instinctual part of our brain reacts, but then, given a second, our smart part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, comes in to interpret the situation. When we go through trauma, it's that process of something going from the instinctual part of the brain through to the prefrontal cortex to be properly interpreted that gets interrupted. Why does it get interrupted? Because when the lower brain region reacts to a potentially dangerous situation, specifically the amygdala, Cortisol and adrenaline is shot up from the adrenal glands, and these elements constrict what we call the hippocampus. And it's like the trauma gets stuck in the lower regions of the brain because the pathway to the prefrontal cortex is blocked. When that happens, the negative effect is we get stuck reacting poorly to any situation, person, or trigger that might remind us of that original bad situation, because it wasn't sorted out in the smart part of the brain originally. Trauma happens when we experience a situation that overwhelms our capacity to cope with that situation. If we experience a feeling of inescapability or helplessness and lack the resources to cope with that situation, this trauma can get stuck in the lower regions of our brain, and it will stay there the rest of our life if we never take the steps to help process it out in a healthy, healing kind of way. That's why so much that happens to us when we're young has such an impact on who we are now, because kids often lack the resources to deal with something difficult or painful. Consider the child that blames themselves for their parents' divorce. Of course it's not their fault, but they don't know what to do with that helpless feeling, and all they can think to do is think that it must have been something that they did that caused this horrible thing to happen. Consider the example of the soldier who is still reacting to loud sounds in different situations, feeling like they are still at war. The instinctual part of their brain is causing them to fear things that aren't logically there. Also, consider the person who doesn't feel comfortable with intimacy because it reminds them of a terribly abusive situation in their younger years. Or someone who won't take certain risks because they know they never want to be hurt like they were before again. These are examples of how trauma has become stuck and it needs to make its way out of the lower regions of the brain through the hippocampus and processed through the prefrontal cortex so that it can be integrated into the person's mind in a healthy way. How do we accomplish this in therapy? Two of the best methods to do this are EMDR and IFS therapy. These therapies make their way to the basement of the mind and help the person process out the bad trauma and help them complete that process so that they don't have to keep reacting to those past fears in the same way. When we are able to let go of the past and live our lives according to our present-day reality, it's like we're no longer living with one or both hands tied behind our backs. We are then able to think and feel more clearly to what is and not what was. The good news about this is that we know why we have these issues, and we know that there is a definite path to letting those issues go. The hardest part sometimes is making ourselves do the work necessary to get that done. People get stuck in the idea that they should be able to just push through it or simply let it go by themselves. What they don't seem to understand is that the reason it's still there is because the stuff from the past needs to be processed out through therapy in order to really let it go. It's actually like a medical procedure if you think about it. I invite you to call or text me about setting up a 20-minute free consultation to discuss further how these types of therapies might work for you.